Well, as you all know, we do not have a ton of time this morning, and we have some really incredible panelists. So I'm going to get started. As we do, you'll start to notice some individuals have put their name and who they're representing in the chat. That's really helpful for us, so please do. Really happy to have you all here this morning. So I'm Tiana Nelson, actually Newly Kennedy, sorry, I forgot my new last name already. And good morning and welcome to the very first morning of the CSU Spur Water in the West Symposium. We're so pleased to have you all here. I am the Assistant Vice Chancellor of External Relations for the CSU system. And we're very excited today to have 4 panelists who represent different partners on the Forest to Faucets program, and excited to have a video that will share a little bit more about the program and then open it up for a conversation with all of you. So please do keep that in mind. Just be thinking about the questions you want to ask these incredible individuals. So I will do some quick introductions of them. Christina Burry is a watershed scientist at Denver Water. She works to inventory, protect, and improve the 2.5 million acres of watershed area in Denver Water's collection system. She also leads Denver Water's innovative watershed management and planning efforts, including forest health investments. Sylvia Bierman is Deputy Director of Renewable Resources for the Rocky Mountain region of the U.S. Forest Service, and just completed over a year working with the U.S. Forest Service state and forestry programs. She has worked for the U.S. Forest Service for over 32 years on national forests in South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado in range management, environmental planning, and management at the ranger district and regional level. Weston Toll is the watershed program specialist at the Colorado State Forest Service. Weston has worked in wildland fire, fuels, and watershed management for 15 years in the federal government, state government, and nonprofit sectors. In his current capacity, Weston works closely with a diverse set of partners to promote healthy watersheds by facilitating education, prioritization, implementation, and monitoring of forest restoration projects. Oh, I lost it. Brett Wolk is the Assistant Director of Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, housed at Colorado State University. CFRI is a congressionally authorized program that serves as a bridge between researchers, managers, and stakeholders working to restore and enhance the resilience of forest ecosystems to wildfires in Colorado and the Intermountain West. So welcome to our 4 panelists. We're so happy to have you here. To kick off our conversation, we'll be watching a short video, as I mentioned, about the Forest to Faucets program and Denver Water's work to improve forest health. As you know, these 4 panelists are all partners on this program, so please keep your questions in mind and feel free to start tossing them in the chat, and we'll be kicking those off shortly after this video. So we'll tee that up. Thank you all for being here.
Denver Water serves 1.5 million people in the Denver metro area, and this is where Denver Water's water supply starts, in the mountains, in the forests. Denver Water goes beyond just thinking about water supply and infrastructure and reservoirs. Denver Water cares about forest health and watershed health. And Denver Water wants to promote the health of the forest, which is why we have the From Forest to Faucets partnership, to create a more resilient forest against catastrophic wildfires, against insect and disease threats. Denver Water works with our partners to promote forest health and reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires in priority watersheds through the From Forest to Faucets partnership, where we partner with the U.S. Forest Service, the Colorado State Forest Service, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service to protect priority watersheds that supply Denver Water's water supply. In this project, in the Peak 7 neighborhood in Summit County, we're also working with Summit County Open Space. Catastrophic wildfires can be really costly to Denver Water and our partners. If a catastrophic wildfire were to occur in this project area, it would cause accelerated sedimentation, accelerated erosion. It would drain to the streams and potentially to Denver Water's infrastructure and reservoirs, which could be really costly to Denver Water. The Peak 7 project benefits many partners. Denver Water benefits because it protects the water supply for our 1.5 million customers, and it protects Summit County's water supply and the communities in Summit County from catastrophic wildfire.
Great. Well, this is an incredibly important program, and we're excited to have our panelists here with us today. So please do put your questions in the chat, and I will read those off for the panel as we get rolling. But to get started, Christina, I'm hoping you could just provide us with a little additional context and kick us off.
Yeah, thank you. So Denver Water's water supply starts out in high elevation forests in the mountains, and then that flows to streams and then to reservoirs and moves across the continental divide where that forest type changes from high elevation to more of the front range type forests. It moves through the continental divide through tunnels and diversions. And then 80% of Denver Water's water supply comes from Strontia Springs Reservoir. And this reservoir was most impacted after the Hayman fire in 2002, which used to be Colorado's largest wildfire, and the Buffalo Creek fire in 1996. So those large scale fires that occurred caused a lot of sediment and debris into Strontia Springs Reservoir. And so Denver Water, having to deal with the costs of being reactive, Denver Water spent approximately $28 million in recovery after those fires, and we're still dealing with the sediment and debris today. And so those costs are what motivated Denver Water to enter into the From Forest to Faucets partnership to make proactive investments working with our partners, because Denver Water only owns, of that 2.5 million acres, we only own 2% of that watershed. And about 54% is national forest. And so we have to partner together and work together to restore the forests and try to prevent these really costly impacts that Denver Water experienced after those fires.
That's really helpful, Christina. Brett, did you want to add anything just related to kind of how that forest health starts out?
Yeah, can add a little bit. So our role at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute is to be a connector between research and management. And so we are housed at CSU, but we primarily work out in the field on projects like this. And we go out with folks like Sylvia and Weston and their foresters and help them actually apply the science on the ground. But then they always have more questions than we can answer. And so we take that back to the research community and try and get more research that's helpful directly to the managers started, or find more useful science that's already out there and can be applied. With Denver's water collection system being so big, like Christina said, and spanning the continental divide, it's important to understand that there's different forest types and different sort of expected fire behavior in those forest types. And so it's really important to prioritize where we're working within that watershed system. 2.5 million acres is too big for anyone to really manage and mitigate all that risk across all that area. And so we help as part of this partnership, and one of the innovative parts that Denver Water helped start is really prioritizing around their key vulnerabilities in the system and within the watershed to get that biggest bang for the buck, and where you can work with the forest ecology to actually reduce the risk to those sources.
Great, thank you. So we have our first question from Matt Harrison with Affiliated Engineers. Would a catastrophic fire ever cause Denver Water to shut off supply to a particular reservoir temporarily, or is the water still usable with significant treatment?
So when we had the Buffalo Creek fire and the Hayman fire, we didn't have to shut off any of our intakes. But that being said, moving forward, that is something that is a consideration, is what's the turbidity threshold at the intake, and keeping an eye on that through water quality monitoring. So it's certainly something to be aware of. I know in talking with City of Fort Collins and Greeley and Northern Water, that's absolutely a consideration, is what the water quality chemistry is, the turbidity is, and the thresholds that they have within their system that could be a limiting factor for whether they're going to take that water or not.
Yeah,
Go
an
ahead, Brett.
important point in these water delivery systems that Denver also has, Christina mentioned 80% of the water flows through Strontia Springs, which is just outside of Conifer in the South Platte. The other 20% goes through Boulder and Gross Reservoir. And so having redundancy in the systems is really critical to make sure that you can continually deliver water. I don't think Denver could rely on just the northern system in Boulder for years, but it's definitely there as a backup. And similarly, northern Colorado and other systems have some of those sort of backup systems drawing water from at least two different basins.
Great. Yeah, that tees up our next question a little bit too. So Peter Sherman asks, when you say Denver, do you mean the city and county of Denver only, or the Metro Front Range, including other cities and counties? So kind of what is the impact area that we're discussing?
Yeah, so we do serve 1.5 million people. And I do consider it to, when you say Denver, it is city, county, Denver. There are distributors outside of that area, so it is more broad than city, county of Denver. Another consideration is Aurora Water too. So even though Denver Water owns and operates Strontia Springs, we get 80% of our water from that reservoir. Aurora Water has their intake and they get 90% of their water from that same reservoir. So it is more broad than just the city, county of Denver.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Christina. So this came up a little bit earlier in terms of other utilities, and just kind of what is this? This seems like a very unique program. Is that the case? Are there other utilities that are doing similar programs? Who are you looking to, and who's looking to Denver Water and the Forest to Faucets program?
I guess I can speak to that a little bit. Yeah, in the last session we had that question, and really Denver Water is the model for this. It's one of the first major water utilities in the nation that's actually made the investment towards forest health and wildfire risk mitigation projects. And so not only other utilities within the state of Colorado, but other major cities around the Western United States are looking to Denver Water in this program kind of as a model for that. There are some other major Front Range water providers that are getting into forest health projects and investing in their watersheds, including Colorado Springs Utilities, as Christina mentioned, Aurora Water, and then Northern Water, which covers much of the northern Colorado area. Those are kind of some of the major ones here on the Front Range that have the funding to put into grant programs and other revenue streams to get this work done. But we're also trying to outreach to some of the more rural water providers in the state too, and see how we can collaborate together to really have that landscape scale change that we need, especially in the biggest zones of concern and high priority areas around the state.
Great. Thanks, Weston. So we have a question from Christopher Madsen. What are some of the actions included in the $23 million dealing with the aftermath of fires?
Yeah, I can speak to the specific costs from Denver Water, and then maybe kick it to Sylvia to talk more about the burned area emergency response from the U.S. Forest Service side. So of that, it was about $28 million that Denver Water had to spend in the recovery after those two fires. Of that 28 million, 18.5 million went towards a dredging operation for Strontia Springs Reservoir. So after those fires, we had about 1 million cubic yards of sediment and debris that drained into Strontia Springs that it was very costly to remove. And so that was the bulk of the cost. There was some increased costs for putting in some sediment basins to try to prevent sediment in Cheeseman Reservoir. So those were some of the specific items that went into that larger $28 million number.
Yeah, I'll touch on our burned area emergency response program that the Forest Service has. So we look at impacts from these landscape events, both short term, which would be really like 6 months or 6 to 9 months after the event, and then the long term would be after that. So the burned area emergency response program looks at that initial time after the event. So for these landscape fires we've had teams out there already looking at them, assessing what work we can do to address the immediate emergency need out there. And an example of that would be putting wood mulch down on steep slopes that had high severity burn to limit whatever would happen if there were like rain events or rapid snow melt. The NRCS also has programs that work with private landowners to do the same work, this emergency work right after a fire. The next phase after that is for us to look at what is the infrastructure we need to replace. Are there check dams we need to put in? Is there more work that we need to do on the National Forest System to limit soil erosion or other impacts from these landscape level events? Unfortunately, we don't have a special pot of money for that. And when we have this level of impact across the state or our region, it's when we're looking to our Washington office and asking for additional funds to address those, because really, if you look at Denver Water's $23 million for those two fires a bunch of years ago, across the burned areas this year, we probably could invest that if we had it. So it's short term and long term, and I think it's work that continues, as Christina described.
Yeah, that's really incredible just to think about all the implications and all of the groups that are needing to be involved in addressing it too. So I would love to hear from each of you a little bit about a project that you're currently working on and or some of the biggest challenges that are coming up in the space in which you're working. So just so we can kind of dive into a slightly broader conversation.
I'll take that second one if I could.
Sure.
Some of the challenges coming up in our field. So there's many challenges. I'm going to highlight a couple here just really quick, and they're somewhat all-encompassing. But the biggest one is climate change, which is really leading to an increase in some of these disturbances we're seeing throughout the state, including an increase in these uncharacteristic wildfires. I would also like to add that fire is a natural part of the environment and has always burned in Colorado and maintained many of our forests, but we've gotten very good at taking the fire out of the ecosystem over the last 100 years or so. And so that's kind of gotten us into the situation where many of our forests are unhealthy and overgrown. So these fires, we're seeing an increase in frequency, severity, and duration. We just saw an event with the East Troublesome Fire where a fire spotted over the Continental Divide in late October, which if you would have told me that earlier in the summer, I'm not sure I would have believed you, but we did see that happen. And so we're seeing some really unprecedented events happening in our forest right now. That's kind of exacerbated by, we're seeing a really high increase in population throughout the state, which not only places an additional strain on our limited water supply, but we're really concerned about the increased population in what we call the wildland urban interface, which is basically the area where structures and other human development intermingles with wildland vegetation. So this is already an issue in our state. Right now, the WUI, which is the acronym we use for the wildland urban interface, encompasses about 3.2 million acres and 2.9 million citizens within the state of Colorado. So this is expected to continue to increase. So we can't really just let fires burn to get back into their more natural way of maintaining our forests, because we do have a lot of folks that live in the forest. And as we've talked about earlier, there's a lot of infrastructure, not only water, but also power and communications infrastructure. So we still do, unfortunately, need to suppress in many areas, but we do need to be talking about how we can really zero down on the landscape and have a good effect doing forest restoration projects. So just quickly to wrap up, I will make a plug. The Colorado State Forest Service just published our 2020 Forest Action Plan, which you can find on our website. And that kind of outlines how we as a state forestry agency are going to tackle some of these issues moving forward in the next 10 years or so.
Great, thanks, Weston. Anyone else want to tackle one of those questions in terms of thinking about some of the big challenges and or a project that's currently energizing you?
I'll touch on the concept of shared stewardship. The way Christina, as she described, in Denver Water's zone of concern, 54% of the, was it 2.5 million acres is national forest. And specifically in Colorado, there's a large percentage of national forest land, but there's also a lot of other owners. It's actually a very complex land ownership pattern with state land, private land, and a lot of work that we need to do to protect our watersheds. So the whole concept of shared stewardship, which I think Denver Water and Colorado State Forest Service we have been in partnership for a while doing this. We've just sort of put a term to it, but looking at the landscape together and finding the priority areas and figuring out how we treat them together, cross-boundary work. Some of the work needs to be done on national forest, some on state, some on private. So as all of the partners come together, we look at it more holistically. And I guess I would say that it's both exciting, but it's also a challenge. If you think about all of the different landowners and everybody's perspectives and values, and pulling that together and finding a place for us to meet and start from and work together. But it's been a great opportunity in Colorado, and I think we're making a lot of progress.
That's great. It's amazing to hear about all the collaboration, but you're right. When you think about all the different values and what people are looking for to happen, we have some common things and common themes, but there's a lot of different things that we're having to work toward. So we do have another question that came up from Nicole Poncelet, and she said, how is Colorado State Forest Service looking at changes in revegetation to align with climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Brett, you can probably chime in here too with some of your latest science. It's something that's addressed throughout our forest action plan. When we looked at our 6 major themes that we addressed throughout the plan, we took the approach of having goals and then strategies to accomplish those goals, and then different approaches to accomplish those strategies. And throughout the plan, we're addressing, climate change as kind of that central theme of what's going to be affecting our forest moving forward. And so there is a bunch of research out there that's trying to show what our forest might look like in the future. There's, expected increase in temperature and decrease in precipitation, that kind of thing, whether, the alpine zone goes higher, the subalpine zone then moves higher from that. And as you go through that transition, there's different species transition which interact in various ways with fire. And so there's been a bunch of research that's gone into that, and we've incorporated some of that into our forest action plan. I'll kick it over to Brett with the science side. He may be able to give a better, more concrete example of that.
And Deanna, I know we only have a couple minutes left, it looks like. So there's a lot of things, especially with the recent fires. We've actually already gone out into the fires with U.S. Forest Service staff on the Cameron Peak fire in particular, and looked at where are there surviving trees that might be able to make seeds and reproduce, and where are the burns really big and intense, and there's no surviving trees and no surviving seeds. And different tree species respond in different ways. Lodgepole pine, which is very abundant in the subalpine and higher elevations, when a high severity burn happens, they have seeds in their cones that actually open with the heat of the fire and drop their seeds right after. So it's adapted to come back after fires typically, whereas species like ponderosa pine that are lower elevations, if you get large patches of those trees burned, they don't come back very readily. So reforestation, and especially in climate change as things get warmer and drier, is what we're anticipating. That might affect the lower elevation species more than the higher elevation. There's some unknowns there, but there's a lot of research that we're going on with impacts to the current fires, as well as thinking about forest restoration within the forest deposits program. How would you go about managing differently? Which tree species might you want to leave for future climates? Would you want to start changing that species composition in the forest moving forward to make it more resilient? Those are some of the questions that we're helping managers grapple with.
Yeah, thank you. And Brett, yeah, you're right. We do only have a few minutes left, but as a final question, I see a lot of educators on this tour today, and we're going to be talking about storytelling as part of Water in the West, and there'll be some sessions that discuss that. But as we think about communicating these important issues to our future generations, do you have any thoughts or things that you have found to be successful as you've worked with students? Whether they're college students or younger than that, but just trying to think about how we're engaging that future generation to really act on some of these important things that you're all working on.
So for the storytelling piece, I think especially after this fire season, it's really, really important to just not forget a lot of the lessons that we're going to learn from these really large scale fires. Certainly it's been over 20 years that Denver Water's been dealing with the aftermath of the Hayman and Buffalo Creek fire. And it's especially now during this fire season, we've had a lot of requests from other water utilities as to what Denver Water did and what the experience was. And a lot of those people that were there during the fires have retired or moved on in their career. And so one thing that I feel like has been really important is to document those lessons learned for future generations, but then also for when we need some advice or recommendations as to what to do when we have these really catastrophic events.
I think another really key message is similar to like, know where your food comes from, know where your water comes from. Even if you live in downtown Denver, your water comes from Dillon and Winter Park when you're skiing up there. So think about the environment and interactions and how it impacts you in the urban areas. And then the other thing is not all fire is bad. And so fire can be bad for water impacts, and burning down houses is obviously horrible, but it's an essential part. We won't have forests if we don't have fire, I think is a good message. Fire is needed to maintain forests in Colorado. And so working on that balance, it's complex. There's no straightforward answers, but the message that fire is a part of our systems and needed to maintain the forest that we have and enjoy and why we live here.
That's great. I love that, Brett. Know where your water comes from. I think that's something that we all feel is important, but I've never even heard it as something as simple as that. Never heard it phrased that way. So I think that's really important for us to help to think about as we empower our next generations. Sorry, go ahead.
Just get some bumper stickers going.
There we go. Yeah, your catchphrases were on point. So nicely done. So I think we're going to need to wrap up there and just want to thank everybody for joining us this morning for this really important conversation. Particularly, please join me in thanking our incredible panelists, Christina, Brett, Weston, and Sylvia. We're so honored to have you here this morning, and that was a really fascinating conversation. And thank you for all the work that you do to protect our drinking water and our forests and just our water in general. We really appreciate you all. And as for all of you participants, thank you for being here and thank you for being part of the CSU Spur Water in the West Symposium. We're looking forward to having you join us over the next 2 days and definitely join for some of the storytelling conversations. There's going to be some really important conversation that occurs at the symposium, and we're excited to have you all be part of it. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you especially to our panelists. Thanks for being here and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone. Take care.